So clearly Europe has not been a terribly sleepy place in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of political turmoil because of the euro crisis, also a lot of suffering because of the euro crisis. But in a certain way, the euro crisis has also distracted political attention from two important developments. One is the deterioration of democracy within EU member states, with Hungary being the main example, and the fact that the European Union as such, and also European citizens to some degree, have not been able to respond to this deterioration in any kind of coherent way. In a certain way, that is a graver threat to the foundations of the European project than even the euro crisis. Money matters, of course, but in a sense the moral foundations are a different issue. Secondly, we've also found that enlargement or Europe's engagement with the wider world is not just up to the EU itself. So people have talked about enlargement fatigue, about the limits of the so-called absorption capacity of the European Union. But what all of a sudden we found in 2013, 2014 is that the extension of the EU association agreements, democracy promotion, if you like, promotion of European fundamental values, all of a sudden we found that this also has a geopolitical dimension. And this has in many ways come as a kind of shock, a reality shock to many Europeans, and arguably Europeans still have not quite figured out a strategy how to face up to this new reality. By normative disintegration, I do mean the fact that even though on paper, which is to say in the European treaties, all EU member states are agreed on certain fundamental values, in practice we have found that either there is no such agreement in the way that we thought was the case, or that some of the relevant institutions, above all the European Council, to some degree the European Commission, are not really ready to defend these values, for instance, with regard to a member state such as Hungary, where these values definitely are under threat, but Hungary is only one example among a number of member states. So it's not as if today in Europe there's a sort of great anti-democratic ideology that is threatening liberal democracy. What I'm more worried about is a kind of slow corrosion from within, because the euro crisis has absorbed so much political attention and capital, that for European elites right now, it's just in a sense easier to turn a blind eye to some of these developments. And I fear that this is something that we will regret. By normative disengagement, I mean that the European Union, again, mostly because of the euro crisis and all the energies, all the attention it has absorbed, has not really been able to play much of a role, I would say, in the context of the Arab Spring. And as we've also seen in 2013, 2014, at this point does not really have a strategy what to do with its eastern neighborhoods. Now, it has often been said, in the context of the Arab Spring in particular, that Europe shouldn't be so engaged because of colonial legacies, that one shouldn't sort of go to these countries, tell people what to do, this would be very patronizing, neo-colonial, and so on and so forth. But it's worth remembering that a number of the same arguments could have been made in 1989 or in the early 90s, when it was a question of whether the EU would enlarge east at all. A lot of us have forgotten that this was a real question at the time. It wasn't a given. It wasn't a decision that everybody, come 1989, felt was inevitable. It was far from it. And one also at that point could have said, no, Germany shouldn't take a leading role vis-à-vis Central and Eastern Europe. Think of the legacies and memories of the Second World War and Nazism and so on and so forth. So I think in certain ways there have been rather convenient excuses for the EU to remain inactive in the last couple of years, and that markedly contrasts with at least some of its stance in the course of the 1990s. But in a sense, the EU has experience and a track record of how one either does enlargement with membership as the ultimate prize. Clearly, in the eyes of European elites and also in the eyes of many European citizens, that's not a realistic option for many of the countries that we've seen emerge at least for a while, into something like more democratic directions in the course of the Arab Spring. But there are also what sometimes are called the 3 M's: money, mobility, and access to markets. And there the EU has a large repertoire of how it can link and, if you like, leverage its powers in certain ways to bring about certain outcomes. It doesn't always work out perfectly, we've learned that too, for sure. But again, we can't really pretend that the EU doesn't have any money, doesn't have any power, or couldn't deploy some of these instruments. Clearly, what it also needs to understand, though, now, is that these are not simply technocratic matters. That, as we've now learned with a vengeance, Russia sees this from a geopolitical and, of course, also to some degree from a normative perspective. That needs to be factored in. But again, in my view, it would be a mistake to simply now retreat and sort of use the existing enlargement fatigue among European citizens as, again, a kind of convenient excuse to say we can't really engage with the world around us anymore. Because sooner or later, the world around us will want to engage with us, or it will come to haunt us in one way or another. So again, without wanting to overstretch the analogy, I think it's worth remembering the early 90s, when also many people said, look, this is going to be very costly to do enlargement. It's not clear that everybody in the old EU, or what was then still the European community, liked this prospect. But think of the alternative. The alternative is a kind of European backyard of constant instability, of economic backwardness, of potentially lots of hostilities. You know, for many of us, sort of the Yugoslav wars have almost receded from memory. Think of that reality. Think how there could have been more of that reality in the 90s. So I think one sort of needs to take a larger view, even though clearly that's not a very popular stance right now. It will be a costly stance, and it's something that, again, European elites might easily shy away from because they have their hands still full with the euro crisis and other challenges.